Hello, everyone, and welcome to our VAC Roundtable. We're up to number 95, and this one we got a special one for you. It is somebody I met in probably one of the most unique places. It started off in Geneva, New York, oddly enough, where I met Caleb and the um, government's actual grow. Which was last September. And we were wandering through the garden and we saw this gentleman and we struck up a conversation. And needless to say, we were blown away by his knowledge, his experience, as well as his breadth of understanding of cannabis, which is, yeah, he's probably one of the younger geniuses, I would say, in cannabis. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Caleb Chen to our discussion. So, Caleb, we're going to get right into it. The first question is a kind of a three-parter in the sense is how did you originally come to cannabis? I.e., when did you first hear of it? When did you first try it? And then when did you realize it was going to become part of your life? So, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Etienne. It's an honor to be here. Um, I'm not sure when it was that I first heard of cannabis, but I'm pretty sure that it probably was in a hip hop song reference. Um, I definitely didn't come to start using it until later in life when I got to college. But before that point, I listened to it, listened to references to it, read lots of references about it online, not just mainstream news media, but resources like Erowid or Overgrow and places where people were actually talking about the plant in a way that wasn't just the government propaganda. And it didn't become what I would say is like a life's work, not until 2023. Up until then, I really just had a vague idea of what I was doing in the cannabis space. And the research that I'm able to do now was, kind of just like a pipe dream back in 2013 when I graduated from my undergrad. I remember explicitly thinking that, I definitely wouldn't be able to go to graduate school to, do cannabis research in 2013. That was before any sort of recreational laws had passed. And fast forward to 2023, and I got the opportunity to go back to grad school and do state-funded cannabis research. And, through that process, I discovered that there very much still is a lack of education on so many levels in this industry, culture, space, whatever we want to call it. And that's a gap, I guess, that I am trying to fill as my life's work.
Right on. Well, being one of those cannabis folk, we'll go right into Marilyn Mathry with our next question.
Okay. Hello, Caleb. You've been judged, you've judged cannabis across the country from East Coast PIF to West Coast terroir. I can't say that word. Terroir.
ROR.
Thank you. Craft. What significant differences do you see merging in regional cannabis identities, and how does that diversity strengthen the culture?
Mm, See, around the country and especially around the world, I think that the regional cannabis identities, as we're referring to them, are mostly based on historical supply patterns. So, we have a ganja culture in certain parts of the old world. There's more of a hashish culture in certain parts of the old world. And here in the United States, we have a ganja culture. You see Etienne there smoking a big old doink full of marijuana, but it's also possible that there could be some rosin in there. And, we've got a hash nouveau culture that's actually stemming now from the New World as well. And really, all these different pockets, once a market develops a taste for a particular cultivar, or cultivar family, that becomes a differentiated segment of like the global cannabis market. And that segment, that niche of the market, they are not going to view other cultivars and other cultivar families as a substitutable specialty commodity for, the one that they've developed a taste for. So what that means is if you try to give a piff lover from New York City some gelato or some wedding cake from California, they're not going to very much like that. If you give a gas head, someone who really likes the OGs from LA, if you give them some of that piff that's popular in certain parts of New York, they're not going to like that. And or even crazier, if you give like a haze lover some piff, they might not even like that. So when we talk about these different regional cannabis identities, we could group them in many different ways, like how old they are, what it is, whether they're a hashish, a ganja culture, all these types of things. But the more separate ones we have, the more chances we have for preserving cannabis genetic diversity. And so I feel that is the best strength of having as many of these different types of cannabis culture uses. And we're just talking about the like explicit drug culture uses right now. And there's plenty of other uses for the plant.
So I have to ask some questions real quick for myself. So a joint in the, I guess, the newer age is that's called a doink.
Yeah, that right there looks like a proper doink.
A
That's a well-known brand.
proper doink. And a piff is a type of genetic, or is that a name for a type of genetic?
So PIF itself is I guess in cannabis genetics terms, generally is accepted to be some sort of haze hybrid. And PIF itself as a term can also just refer to really dank weed or even dank music. At this point, there is a well-known website and underground hip hop steward website known as Dat Piff. And you want to be smoking that piff while you're listening to that piff.
Thank you for clarifying, educating us. Nate has a follow-up as well. Councilmember Landau.
Hey, I know this isn't the, but what do you think has influenced it? I know there's Instagram hype and
Oh,
stuff
your
like
mic
that.
is cutting in and out. You have to hold it steady. We can't hear you
Is
very well.
is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so I know it's a little hard to answer this question, but what do you think? I know you mentioned some music. There's Instagram influencers that are local, but why is it this, as, especially like 10, 15 years ago when it was harder to get weed, that this certain genetics, that's what people had and they got used to it? Or is there something further behind why people like certain genetics over others?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So you definitely have the markets where the supplies are coming from certain places and the genetics that compromise that supply, that comprise that supply rather, um, you know, become what people are used to. But then there's also even within a particular geography, you could have certain people that require or that are using cannabis for one purpose, and then people that are using cannabis for a separate purpose, and they might end up preferring different genetics for that purpose. I've talked with people, for instance, we mentioned like gas heads from LA, but historically, I've heard of in multiple decades, people from LA that would be paying more per pound or per ounce for certain genetics being grown in different parts of the state that, might be longer flowering varieties, as an example, or it might be more, unique genetics in terms of being from like different land race crosses and not from the same building blocks that other more common genetics are from.
And got another follow-up from my Councilmember Crowitz. Councilmember?
Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, Caleb, good to see you. I guess this question just popped in my head as a result of just the dialogue, not really directly related to what we're talking about, but I just wonder what your take is on we've seen a couple of entities emerge trying to match up a particular person's genetic profile with a particular variety or product lines of cannabis. Just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, if you run into that.
I've definitely run into a few of those companies that, like do like a 23andMe type DNA test, and then they'll look to see what genes that there might be certain research associated with that might, say that you're predisposed to this or predisposed to that. And I think at this current point in time in 2025 that there just hasn't been enough research done to make that truly useful. Like we are just now seeing the first double-blind studies that look at, pure THC distillate plus one terpene, right? Like we're still just barely mapping out like what the entourage effects, because there's multiple different ones probably, actually are. And at this point, like that's just on the chemical end. On the genetic side, I truly believe that like all the existing research that has been done with cannabis plants has only looked at a subset of like the actual available cannabis in the world, and that in and of itself is limiting the potential insights from that type of technology currently.
Very well discussed, and you are definitely wise in the ways of the weed. Okay. Well, we're going right back to Member Nate Landau for his next question. Council Member?
Hey, first, Caleb, it's great to see you. I met you in Meadowlands in Mendocino, and I was wearing Myrtle's shirt that had a map of Africa with 52 different ways to say cannabis on it. And I was very disappointed that everyone but you could not get, most people couldn't even recognize it was Africa, but you recognized right away. And then I turned around and you saw that it was Myrtle's shirt. And then we started talking about the cannabis embassy, and it was just so random that in the middle of nowhere, there's someone that actually heard about it. So I just really appreciate you. And every time I meet you, it's been a great conversation. Now, I'm warning you, this is going to be a long question, but here I go. Your work focuses on the globalization of Cali weed. Our Veterans Action Council has been studying potential scenarios for cannabis trade post-federal descheduling, and our team members recently attended an international cannabis dialogue in the Caribbean region. The path to market for craft California cannabis we see is as niche international medicinal cannabis product. This market will be guided not only by Vienna drug control treaties, but also by conventions and treaties monitored in Geneva and on behalf sharing the protection of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. What we see for the international market of non-medical cannabis is a tough road until perhaps a decade from now when we finally deschedule cannabis and the drug control treaty itself. What are your thoughts on the future of markets for high quality land raised craft cannabis, and what path do you see for California? Thank you.
That is a great question. So I guess one way to dissect that would be to start off by saying that like it's a point of contention whether or not, California has land races. So I guess like if, descheduling were to happen right now, if we were talking about a market, international market of land races, like does California's offerings enter in as, land race craft cannabis, or, is it more of like an heirloom offering, or does it maybe depend on what exactly it is we're talking about, whether it's something from a specific cultivar or a cultivar family, to use the language from before. My first thought for that question is that California cannabis is already a niche international medicinal product that, commands a premium, and it does not matter how many different layers of government there are that say that it is illegal. Somehow these transactions are still happening, and genetics are still flowing over borders. But to that end, the fact that genetics are still flowing over borders, and that there are now international, considerations that should be taken into consideration when genetics are moving over borders. The benefits sharing that you were talking about, that is now codified by the Nagoya Protocol at the UN level. Um, in in these types of instances, it's important to recognize that a lot of California's like recent cannabis history is arguably built on, colonial biopiracy techniques, which are now more or less explicitly banned, but definitely still ongoing. And the whole concept of genetic protections, um, protection of genetic resources, and benefits sharing that is like legally protected and enforceable in courts of law still, haven't fully been sussed out because of continued federal scheduling of cannabis. It's the same thing that's been stymieing the research, is also stymieing like the protections of the actual cannabis plant, whether that's, the flower or hash that's moving out of California, or if it's, genetics that are moving to another place where it's legal, where it can then be grown and be sold as California cannabis, even though at that point, what is its association with California, in that particular iteration, I guess. So in the current era, I definitely see California still as a source of new, high quality craft cannabis genetics. Whether someone's definition of craft includes indoor or if there's some sort of acre cap there, it doesn't matter. California is still kind of where people are looking for that. And whether or not that leaves legally as flour, hash, seeds, cuts in a petri dish or something, or, knowledge about certain genes that can then be turned on in another country, stuff like that is the question, I guess.
Councilmember Davis has a follow-up as well. Councilmember?
Yeah, Caleb, hey, this is all great information. I have a follow-up, and I'm just curious, you're talking about genetics, you're talking about California, Cali weed, and how it's, far superior. And what do you think? Would make this product, this fine herb that we have out here. Like I just picked up some White Widow a little bit ago. And what is it about this cannabis, and the genetics that are out here, that is so different, than say something that's either grown, maybe in Canada or Hawaii? Would Are we talking about the terroir? Are we talking, the genetic seed? Is there something that you could just maybe do like a quick breakdown, or is this something that's too complex to maybe even explain? Or is it a multi-factor kind of thing? Yeah, I'd just love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely multi-factor. What I was referring to earlier, where like in the differentiated market where people are like paying a higher price for Cali weed that they know it was grown in Cali, versus Cali weed that was grown in Canada, for instance, or Cali weed that was grown in Spain, where there's actually this term, SPALI, which stands for Cali genetics, grown in Spain and then sent to Amsterdam to be sold. And so, like, in this sense, if we were to look at like the average trap menu in a like third tier city in France, which is still very much under the prohibition, the most cheap hash would be some Moroccan land races, some Moroccan hash, maybe €5 a gram. And then as you work your way up, the middle tier stuff might be more local stuff like Spanish and more European produced hash. And then when you get up to the like €40 a gram hash, it would be imported stuff from California. And in that sense, it's higher quality. But really, if someone were to do the testing there, they'd probably find that those prices are generally matching with THC percentage. And so in terms of like higher quality, if you're a medicinal user and you actually need some CBD in your hash for your desired effect, you're actually going to probably find the Moroccan hash to be higher quality if that's your gauge of quality. And so there's a lot of like skewed, um, I guess, information there, but also, in markets, because markets are where you have, people competing on perfect or imperfect information. you also end up seeing um, that like the genetics are, I think, what make California special in that we see those very genetics that would make up the hash that is worth more currently. Then that gets sent over to Morocco, and then they grow it. And at that point, maybe it is a difference of the terroir, but um, that whole entire scenario is also happening on a trap menu that is entirely indoor products. So it's not entirely sure that the terroir is the differentiating factor there.
It's a fascinating discussion. Nate, you got to follow up too.
Yeah. You mentioned craft and you very briefly went over definitions, but that's something that I've struggled with. I've done a whole webinar on it. We still
Mhm.
can't come to a conclusion. So in beer, let's say, up to 60,000 liters a year, it's a very clear-cut number. Then you can call yourself a microbrewery. So in the beer and different industries, it's very clear-cut. In cannabis, how do you see while we define this craft? You can have a 100,000 square foot facility, but you do a very small living cell room, and that could be craft, or you only produce 5 pounds of it. Like, what do you see the definitions of craft being in the future?
That is such a good question. I think it's gonna end up being legally defined, um, depending on the different cultivation types and license types properly, probably, some equivalent of 60,000 liters. And I would not pretend to know what that number is or to decide that for the actual, craft growers and farmers out there, or just people that want to use that term. Obviously that the people who are undeniably craft growers and farmers of a certain size are trying to keep that word away from the people who are just growers and farmers that want to use that word for purely capitalistic reasons. And it's a very delicate battle that's definitely being fought right now.
Well, okay, so it is being fought right now, but what do you consider? What does Caleb consider craft, right? Is it like small batch, a rare genetic? Is it just grown a certain way? Is a long arcing, harvesting in March haze? You know what I'm saying? What is craft to you?
So craft grown versus craft bred in what you're describing, I would definitely think of differently. And the I look at kind of the I guess I've been influenced a lot by the way that Kevin Jodrey talks about craft and like getting back to like the etymology of it and like with your hands, right? So if you've outsourced any of the like plant touching portion, right? Like for growing, like I said, it's something I try not to talk about, but I definitely have drawn a line for what I consider, craft breeding, right? Like if you are not smoking the plant at any point in your breeding decision making, I no longer consider that craft if outsource that to a lab test that's only looking at a handful of terpenes or cannabinoids. So, there, yeah, whatever that like by hand, whatever the things that when you stop doing it by hand, whenever the person stops doing it, or whenever it gets outsourced, whether that's to, a more inexperienced person, once you start having like losses due to inefficiencies, then it's no longer craft.
Wow, thank you. We have a series of questions to ask you, but we're a bunch of stoners, so we got other questions too. Mike Crowitz has our next question. So, Michael Crowitz, take it away.
I got to hand it to you there. That was an interesting little rabbit hole, and I had to really think about it myself. I use that term a lot, but I've never really thought about it. I generally use the term craft cannabis, not craft cultivation or craft genetics or any other variation. And to me, craft cannabis, as I was just thinking about it, is all based on the product. If you can produce a carefully produced product that matches, what I have in my head as to what I'm looking for. And that brings me to, the sort of the backup of this question. It's interesting. We worked on some of this stuff for several years now. You're the only like the second person we've talked to that actually mentioned Nagoya, other than our mentors over in Geneva and Barcelona who are working in that stuff day to day inside the what's called the World Intellectual Property Organization or WIPO. But yeah, we actually had David Watson, Sam the Skunk Man, over to Vienna to talk about the future of cannabis markets, and he talked about how we basically did that, sort of colonial model of genetic exchange, and how, even in our more purest form of our, anti establishment illegal cannabis trade, we still wound up following, the same routes and doing things in the same way, but with consent. That was the thing that he was basically, talking about is what we did in the 60s and 70s, to try to proliferate the cannabis around the world was with consent. And he said, it's no reason to go backwards and try to unwrite that or create reparations or anything. Like, he was big on that. We shouldn't be looking backwards, but we should draw a line and moving forwards, do it right. And when you're talking about Nagoya and benefit sharing, that's stuff we need to really get in our heads, I think, and understand how to do that right. But for the purpose of this question, though, the real crux of it is the disruption to the genetics themselves. That there was, as I see it, and from our outcome of our meetings with, in Vienna with David and all, there's like two different disruptions. There was the disruption of the markets, and then there was the disruption of the genetics themselves. And we talked a little bit about the markets, but the genetics, like he was talking about uh, sort of a generalized, sort of hybridized cannabis that has gotten to the point where it's hard to find, the actual proper clean genetics anywhere in the world. I just heard, recently now, and we're very interested. Veterans Action Council is very interested in learning more about what they're doing in the hills there in the reef in Morocco to protect genetics and come up with a safe zone that only has genetics that are acclimated to that zone in that zone to protect the genetics from, adulteration, I guess you'd call it. But anyway, this is the question. So you've researched how cannabis genetics evolved post-prohibition. What are the most surprising changes you've uncovered, and what do those shifts mean in preserving true legacy cultivars?
Hmm. I think one thing that comes to mind is that like people have different time scales when they're referring to the term legacy. And so in terms of like I think I've heard someone use this term before, genetic like backwash, like hybrids, modern hybrids being sent to say Mexico or Colombia or Jamaica or Morocco, um, being grown there and then contaminating the landrace populations that are there. And so what I think of the time scales, right? Like we, based on what we know now, based on the best like academic research up to date, we can say relatively definitively that like Mexican land races, Colombian land races are not as old as, Afghani land races or Paki land races or Chinese land races, for instance. And whether these different landrace populations, they became the building blocks of modern hybrids. And there are certain landrace populations that did not become building blocks for modern American hybrids because, American collectors at the time did not have access to them. So speaking of like David Watson, he is very well traveled, but he never went under the Iron Curtain, for instance. Right. So he didn't have any seed collections from, say, Kazakhstan, even though later on in his career, he did get access to genetics that came from under the Iron Curtain once the Iron Curtain fell. And so, when what I found in my research is that of these building blocks, as people have been breeding them over and over again in creating our modern hybrids, that they've been selecting really in a few key directions. And that could be, high THC. That's one that people talk about a lot, lowering the CBD level and raising the THC level. Another thing is shortening the flowering time. There's so many stories about before the first quote unquote Afghanica introductions of land races from Afghanistan, the Middle East, Pakistan, of hash plants that flowered earlier. Breeders in America and Canada, their main goal was to, cross the earliest Mexicans and Colombians and Jamaicans and things that they had access to together to just make something that would finish for them outside. And, through this process, you find that there are certain like environmental and economic limitations that kind of dictate what people grow and genetics wise. And so as prohibition has, risen, fallen, checkerboarded, we've kind of seen that the price per pound has fallen, right? Versus a decade or 2 decades ago. And this is across the board. And in that sense, the biggest change is that like people are only growing the shorter flowering stuff, and this extends to all the way to like research not being done on longer flowering cultivars to longer flowering cultivars and cultivar families not being present on the market, whether that's the legal market or the black market. And um, this is all just without even talking about that genetic backwash, where if you have only these particular subset of hybrids going back into landrace populations, whether or not they will contaminate that genetic pool is also a open question. There are experts that believe that, it's maybe already too far gone. And there's experts that believe that no, there are still wild, untouched by human populations out there. And, if the number of untouched populations is falling because of human activity, then that's a certain amount of stuff that is not being preserved. Long-winded answer, sorry.
No, there's no apology for education at all. Mike Davis has a follow-up.
Yeah, man. Hey, I'm really glad we're talking about this because these are all things that I've kind of wondered about. And one thing I've kind of wondered about are like you think about like Robert Clark and David Watson who have literally traveled all around the earth like collecting seeds. And one, is there anyone still currently doing that? And then two, if they are or haven't or whatever, is there any list of countries, that's documented somewhere of all the landrace seeds and genetics that, have been so far collected and have yet still to like maybe, like kind of like what you're talking about. The experts are kind of like, hey, we fear that it's too late. Is there anyone that's like kind of gone out and seen what's out there?
They're def Someone else. There are definitely hobbyist collectors that have been active throughout this whole time. There have been even like government uh led initiatives to do kind of what you're saying, whether that's way back in the day where, like the Russia's Vavilov Institute was collecting seeds from landrace populations within its effective borders, or the field that I met Etienne in is technically a US government hemp germplasm laboratory project to um to receive and grow as many different types of hemp, including, drug type hemp. What a funny term. Um, Stuff. And then there's also apparently similar projects in China. And really, when we look at all these projects, like none of them have been able to collect from everywhere in the world. And, from what we know of ongoing discussions relating to stuff like the Nagoya Protocol, like even if they could, there'd still be a whole other can of worms. And when we talk about benefits sharing, like the way the UN would have it is obviously like government to government. And the way that we would have it is people from this culture, probably wouldn't be that way because the ones that have been stewarding these land races, for instance, in Afghanistan right now, like would benefits sharing, UN compliant benefits sharing involve the US government somehow sending money to the Taliban for seeds? Like that's what's supposed to be happening, right? But what at what point um will we see something that actually represents benefit sharing the way that we see outside of the cannabis plant, where there is kind of, more progress, still very much inching along. It does rely on like the descheduling to have the research together. That's why the work that y'all do is so important. Well, I'm so honored to be here with y'all.
Well, we're honored to have you, sir. Well, Mike, we're going right back to you, Mr. Davis, for the next question, council member.
All right, cool. So as a moderator of the largest cannabis community online, r/trees, what trends are you seeing in how younger consumers understand quality, culture, and history, and where do they get it wrong?
Oh man. So on the tree subreddit, most of the time what I'm doing is like removing posts from underage people or removing posts that are being like, oh, I just landed in Lisbon, who's got the hookup, stuff like that. And but at this shows like how really like on the ground it is, and then people are just going there with their most basic questions. And from that lens, I very much feel that education is still sorely lacking. And especially when it comes to younger consumers, say the ones that are not legally allowed to participate in the legal market, um, they are the ones that are falling victim to all the miseducation campaigns that are out there, for lack of a better word. And whether that's like a government-led miseducation campaign, like the DARE program at a school, or whether that's one led by a company that's, intentionally misnaming its cultivars or, pretending that something is something that it is not. And, so let's see. There's a trend that I'm seeing that kind of counters that is that people are noticing the cracks in the system, right? There was a post from last week where someone posted a picture of two cartridges that they had bought from the dispensary in California. Both of them allegedly made from a cultivar called Watermelon Z, and one of the cartridge packages was labeled indica, and the other cartridge package was labeled sativa. And they just posted the two packages next to each other, being like, "Someone please explain." And there's so many different things to explain there, right? Like sativa, indica, generally people think of it as sitting on a spectrum, and that really like there's a false dichotomy where you have sativa on one end of a spectrum, like the uppity feeling end, and indica on the bottom feeling end. But words have meanings outside of cannabis, and I advise that everyone pay attention to those meanings, right? Sativa just means cultivated, which means all cannabis we've ever talked about is cannabis sativa, for better or for worse. And indica means from India. And that's not something that we can change as stoners, and that's something that it is part of it. So that's what I'm trying to say is, but spectrums and dichotomies are a useful way for learning things. So instead of having the sativa indica false dichotomy, really like people should think of that as there's other spectrums. Sativa sits in a dichotomy with ruderalis, and this is obviously another whole can of worms, but ruderalis just means ruderal just means like barrel, let's say, whereas sativa means cultivated, right? They're just two ends. One is actively being used by humans, one is actively not being used by humans. That's all those words mean. And indica, afghanica, all these other terms that have been used in Latin binomials, chinensis, they just refer to geographic regions where things are from. So, you know, anytime there's a chance to like educate on this, I feel that that is what I'm seeing be most impactful for younger consumers because these are like there are cracks all over um in the education that people are receiving. And as soon as you can kind of dig into there and find the things that are logically, botanically consistent, it will definitely help in your cannabis journey, I feel.
All right, so we've got follow-ups. Myself, then Mike Crowitz, then Nate. So, um, my God, I mean, running Reddit has got to be its own set of challenges, right? You've got quite a few moderators, but you're catching up to marijuana as well as to, cannabis in the sense, how does, each one of those is a cannabis um moderation or education chain, I guess you would call it, right? So why was trees is it trees is just the younger, newer terminology like a Gen Z or what makes that over? Because I belong to all the communities, the cannabis communities inside of Reddit, and there's multiple ones. So
Mhm.
what differentiates trees from everybody else?
Trees was the first marijuana enthusiast subreddit on Reddit in the early 2000s. And the reason why it now flies under the moniker Trees is there was like a Reddit inside joke where the moderators essentially switched their marijuana enthusiast forum with a legitimate tree arborist forum on Reddit. And so now if you were to go to reddit.com/r/marijuana enthusiasts, you'll see a bunch of arborists talking about their favorite trees. And the trees as a term, as a slang term for marijuana, as far as I can tell in my research, started in the Bay Area, same as Reddit, probably a decade or so before. It starts popping up in rap songs around the 90s.
And you are a lyric and a cannabis historian for music, correct, as well?
Yeah, some of the research that I've done includes looking at you know, hip hop mentions of the slang term Cali weed and other slang terms referring to cannabis, and you can really see like you can track the spread of even specific genetic names, right? Like you can tell when was the first time that gelato was popular as a song lyric or a song title or an album title, and then see corresponding interest in the actual genetic rise.
For me, that's always been fascinating and culturally because, each generation has always had their own slang and terminology for cannabis. Because even when I was learning in the 80s, I was learning lid and all those sort of things, but lid was already gone because an ounce used to fit on a lid. And so that's what people would ask for way back in the day. So it's always been fascinating to watch the genealogy of the language change generation to generation and how it takes hold, right? From kind bud was something we used to utilize, but that's gone the way of the world, except for, my generation. So it's fascinating how songs and especially during Prohibition and before all of this, slang had to be used for protection because of how onerous Prohibition was. So I'm not trying to go too far off that, but continuing on with Michael Crowitz.
Yeah, man. I guess you're getting kind of a record number of follow-up questions, but I really appreciate it. The thought process. I got two different questions, totally different actually. The first one is on the same vein, and that is, I was at one of the last Seattle Hemp Fest that I spoke at. It was like one of the lower state, the further out stages, and I don't know. I just had a wild hair to ask some poll questions while I was on stage talking about cannabis, and one of them was, did anybody ever hear of Jack Herer? And like two hands went up in the audience, and I was like, oh shit. And it's not that the kids need to know who Jack Herr is. I'm not so sure that matters. But I think if they're not grounded in the story, I think they're missing out on something quite beautiful. The story of cannabis in the United States is, looking back at Limar and Amorphia, a lot of the work predating Normal and all that by decades, is just truly beautiful, and is a whole layers and layers of art, and music and culture that I think if they're not grounded in that, if young people don't have any access to that. And I just realized that, as we're talking, I don't think there is anything like that. I don't think there's any real good documentaries. There's some documentaries about cannabis and stuff that talk about that time period, but they talk about it from the governmental side, talking about Anslinger or whatever, not really talking so much about our story as a cannabis movement. Inside the Veterans Action Council, we're just working on a list now of veterans that we've deemed to have made a significant contribution to the cannabis cause, and we've got up to over 100, like 125, including Jack Herr, as a military vet. I just wonder, like, on that side, maybe you've got a view, and maybe it's not as depressing as I think it is. Maybe, kids do a lot more research, but it seems like you can be jaded over by new information that doesn't really lead you down any significant path. Anyway, before you answer that, let me just throw some out you as a follow-up question, which is something I don't think I've ever done with somebody, but I'd like you to think about it, maybe get back to us later, unless you have an answer off the cuff and you've gotten way ahead of me. But our team working on this, stuff with Nagoya, Convention on Biological Diversity, all that, they've taken great heart in this new agreement that was signed about a year ago, called GRATIC, the Genetic Resources and Traditional Knowledge Treaty. And I'd be interested if you would look at that and see if some of the things that you were looking at in Nagoya hadn't been fixed. Anyway, that's an ongoing conversation for another level of cannabis activism that we're involved in, where we're actually going to those meetings. We can actually make an impact on that level. I think, our industry is going to be in for a shock when cannabis is descheduled or removed from the Controlled Substance Act, whatever, and then all of a sudden they learn about all this, big world that's out there that has treaties and agreements and stuff. The United States may not sign on to this and may not follow it, but if you want to do international trade with all these countries that do follow it, you need to learn it. But anyway, the GRATIC, if you haven't heard about it, let's talk later and follow up on that. I'd really, really be interested in
Absolutely.
your input.
Yeah, I will take a look and reach out.
Yeah, careful. We'll recruit you for our international team. We'll put you in the UN, bud. All right. Nate Landau's got another follow-up.
And so I wanted to go on something you said, that words have meaning, and they do. So when I go to the supermarket and I want a Granny Smith apple, I know right away. And if they try to pass something off as they say it's Granny Smith and it's not, I take one bite and I know it's not Granny Smith. How do you see that we do that in cannabis, where seeds were brought from all over the world and made a million hybridization? I know it's a very big question, but what can we do where one day you walk into the dispensary and the strain will really have meaning? The strain name will really have meaning.
So I think a useful way to look at this is kind of like, it has meaning at the store or on the trap menu for a very small subset of what's presented. And it's actually like just the newest stuff, right? So like if you have the very first release of some new cultivar, and before anyone even knows to copy it, at that point, you can be sure that you are getting that thing. But at that point, it has no market demand, it has no familiarity. So it doesn't, it doesn't help in that sense. So I think that in some ways we have to go beyond like the name itself, but still recognize that the name is like some marker. It's the name that the grower was given, whether that's from the nursery or from the breeder or from their own notes. It is one data point. The other data points that we can get Because there's lots of instances where, the grower is growing something where they might not even know the name for sure. And at that point, they might ethically feel obligated to like not pass it off as the name that they were given it as and, rename it to something else. And like in all these scenarios, um, I guess we can look at other data points, whether that's flowering time, whether that's terpene dominance, whether that's the chemotype. And really once we have enough information there where if there's a person that instead of going to the store and saying, I'm looking for Blue Dream, and then having a bunch of different Blue Dream options to look at, maybe instead they know that they want something that is, in the teens of THC percentage, has a 10 to 1 to 20 to 1 range of also having CBD in it, and it has, these three terpenes and not these three other terpenes. And, maybe they find that the specific Blue Dream of the 20 that's available that they like is the one that is pinene dominant and not myrcene dominant. And you might have someone else who finds that the quote unquote Blue Dream that they like is the one that is terpinolene dominant, even though that's might be one that's actually just mislabeled something else. But what they're going to be able to narrow down on stuff that's actually provable as opposed to the unprovable stuff, which is just the name. Um, yeah, so yes, words have meaning, and so do the people saying them. And yeah, if there's a like a bad actor, then yeah, those words might not have as much meaning.
Very well stated. You are, yeah, you're a very good communicator, Caleb. Next up will be Mary Lynn Mathry with our next question.
All right. Yeah, that is interesting. And I like the fact about sun growing stuff here. So you talk a lot about terroir and sun grown cannabis. How do you explain to consumers, especially those who only know indoor, why terroir matters and what they're missing? And I'm a lover of outdoor plants, so I want to hear this answer.
So the analogy, like the convincing speech that I find most salient for me is like the food analogy. I've experienced the happenstance where, like I'm at a fancy restaurant where I know that like I'm with someone who's like paying hundreds of dollars to eat food that was definitely all grown and raised outdoors, in just the most paying tip-top dollar for that, but then they'll leave between course 4 and 5 to go smoke some indoor hydro in the parking lot, right? And there's a I guess lack of education there to go back to that. And so, without having to get into any science at all, I'll just, throw that out there and be like, no one's paying extra for indoor grown truffles to be shaved on top of their pasta that was made from indoor grown wheat and then, you know, topped with indoor grown Parmesan and whatever the hell. So that's one whole can that I like to open. But another one on the complete science end is that there actually has been a study done where at Columbia University, they worked with some farmers and growers in California, licensed ones. The farmers that they worked with were Huckleberry Hill Farms and Moon Maid Farms in Humboldt. And so they distributed the exact same clone to these sun-grown regenerative farmers. And then they also gave that clone to like some of the top indoor growers in Humboldt as well. And then at the end, these um, the resulting flower was analyzed um, using non-target analysis. So they were able to find that, yes, the indoor cannabis, the indoor version did end up having a higher THC level, right? So this goes back to the previous discussion that the THC level was your only measure of quality. If Marinol is your highest quality THC product, then that's then that's that. But yeah. And when But what they did find with the stuff that was grown outdoors, roots in ground and with the sun, is that they had a wider variety of cannabinoids and terpenes. And I'm sure if they did the same test for the other types of secondary metabolites, esters, thiols, ketones, whatever have you, that it probably would have been the same as well. Where you end up with a wider variety, which means you get a stronger entourage effect, or at least that's my, stoner read of it when we take that proven science, or that observational science that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then try to like boil it down to something that I can actually, yeah, talk about or use as input into my own like purchasing decisions. Because if it comes to that exact same clone grown by an outdoor cultivator or an indoor cultivator, which actually is a decision that a lot of people get to choose. To know that scientifically there's all this evidence that shows that you might end up with a better medicinal therapeutic effect from the outdoor grown one because it has more chemicals that can interact with each other and can interact with your endocannabinoid system, more chemicals in terms of like the amount of disparate ones, not the raw amount of a particular chemical.
Exactly. All right. Great shit, man. Man. Love it, love it, love it. Absorbing a lot here. All right. Next up will be Council Member Nate Landau. Council Member, take it away.
You traveled the world seeking cannabis culture. What region outside the US has impressed you the most? And what unique practices or perspective from those communities should Americans learn from?
Now, my first thought to this question was that, the like social club scene and things like that from Europe that does not happen in America. It is something that I think bears looking more into. And along the same lines, right? Like making sure that home grow is enshrined is something that I see, non-American jurisdictions taking more seriously. And like the amount of places in America that are allegedly cannabis legal where you cannot home grow is just heinous in my mind. And so, around in my own personal travels, I've had two experiences that really shaped the way that I view cannabis. And one was smoking hash in Morocco, which, would have been my first experiences with lower THC hash, but also hash that had CBD in it, right? And just noticing that that is distinctly different feeling than any hash I'd ever smoked up until that point. And then similarly, on a trip to Malaysia, I got to smoke Highland races for the first time. And so that was probably my longest flowering cannabis experience. And that's even counting all these, haze and haze hybrids that I've been smoking since. And in these experiences, I know that my body got to tussle a little bit with minor cannabinoids that, it hadn't necessarily encountered while consuming in the States. And, it's not that necessarily that there are perspectives on like legal cannabis that can be had from these places where that are still completely under the prohibition. But, definitely the the genetics are very salient to me. And the fact that like in these super limited markets that are still very much under the prohibition, the use patterns still end up dictated by the available genetics in many ways. And I think that that is like a commonality that should be celebrated because that's kind of the commonality that we see in any given circle where people are consuming cannabis with each other is that they feel common. They feel something in common with each other. And, of all the places I've been to, whether it's perfectly legal, like Canada, and I can order it through the mail, or I could swipe with my credit card, or it's still very much under the throes of like, you'll lose your life if you get caught smuggling it type of thing. Um, that the feeling of the community, of the people that are willing to take whatever the risk is to have access to medicine. That's the through line that is like most unique, surprising, but also familiar, and just cherished and welcome.
That is absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. All right. Next up will be Council Member Michael Crowitz. The
Let's
next
see. This question, I should preface by saying that I'm on the board of the Origins Council, and I've worked behind the scenes, a lot of the stuff going on on the margins of this question. But I think it all makes the question all that much more relevant, that you're talking to folks that can actually operationalize your words. But yeah, legacy genetics, community-driven research are central to your work at Cal Poly Humboldt. What role do veterans, activists, and longtime growers play in preserving those genetics and the stories behind them?
So through my work at Cal Poly Humboldt, I went there as a student in 2023 to do a master's in public sociology. And I went there specifically because that the Department of Public Sociology, a professor there, Dr. Dominic Corva, had just received a grant, or he was working with Origins Council and LeafWorks and um, UC Berkeley and the United Core Alliance to study legacy genetics in a project called Legacy Genetics, People and Their Plants, a community-driven study. And the work that I've been doing with Dominic is ethnographic interviews. And so we have talked with people to learn about their communities. And some of the people that we talked to have been veterans. And in talking with veterans and also when looking at the historical record, like there's an undeniable connection between like, some of the strongest activists that have been mentioned already, others that have not been mentioned already, and and whether their veteran status has, like is why they came to cannabis or not, it seems to be a clear part of their continued passion and then their strength in pursuing things. And what we've seen is that like historically, veterans have served as like a cultural introduction point of drug cannabis culture for centuries. And this is something that's been documented, between like Africa and Europe, within Asia, between say, Panama and, between Vietnam and the States. Like there's all sorts of genetic flows that are associated with veterans, even without talking about the activism that we were talking about just now. And what I found when it comes to like medicinal uses of cannabis is that there are certain there are certain uses of cannabis that might not be the most popular, but they're medicinal uses. And that could be the use of CBD dominant cultivars for epilepsy treatment, use of whatever type of cultivars it is that certain veterans find better for PTSD, stuff like that. It ends up that certain communities end up being the stewards of these types of genetics because they're the ones that are reliant on the particular chemical profiles that are provided by those genetics. And without a doubt in my mind, veterans are one such of those communities that have not only been moving the genetics all over the world, but have been, working them in very specific ways for very specific purposes. And not just that, because that's obviously true for lots of communities, but sharing it in a way that is, no matter how deep the prohibition is, that like I think the sharing portion is particularly strong in the veteran communities that I've heard about.
Right on. All right. Next question will be Mike Davis.
All right. You often describe cannabis as a relationship between people and plants. So in your view, what responsibilities do we have culturally, scientifically, and spiritually as stewards of that relationship moving forward?
Ah, no, but what Mike was saying earlier about doing a live poll at the last Seattle Hemp Fest and like, only two people saying that they knew who Jack Hare was is I think it's very much a common symptom. And like Mike was saying, it's not that they necessarily need to know who he was, like be able to pull his face out of a lineup or something. But that history of of the medical marijuana movement prior to, you know, all this stuff we have since 2014 and, even earlier in some other regions is uh since Prop 64 and since 2014, if we're talking about Oregon and Washington, is it's just so yeah. I lost my train of thought there. It's the education that something came before like the commercial cannabis that we have now, and like being able to recognize the stewards that gave us the stuff that we have currently, whether that's the current political regime, whether that's the genetics that are still around, whether that's the activism that's still around. That I don't know, like history, I guess, is the catch-all term for it, but I feel like it's something that's being lost. And I'm not sure how it's meant to be captured and maintained. I just know that it needs to be. And I feel like the medicinal uses of cannabis, which are things that people will pay for, but for reasons other than capitalism, right? Like, um, these are like niche markets in a purely economic sense, but they're especially niche because the demand for them is always going to be small. The same reason why a pharmaceutical company will not spend billions of dollars to do research on a disease that only 1 in a billion people have. Um, it for people in that scenario, or you know, just on the other side of cold calculating decisions like that, all we have are these types of human plant, human fungi, human relationships. And, so I guess what I'm trying to say is like sans the research that we all desperately want and are working hard to make sure is possible in our own way, that what we have is the observational science that people experimenting with different types of cannabis have been able to provide. And really, like, that has been the source of so much scientific knowledge that I think it's unreasonable to think that there's still not more scientific knowledge that can be proven out from stuff that we already know as like observational scientists, I guess is something that I really feel. And the responsibility of like us in this more commercial time is to make sure that that medical history isn't lost, and that these medicinal uses of cannabis, including the constituent chemistry and genetic diversity that's needed to make sure that these are even possible, is still out there. Yeah. And that can happen on historical, educational side. That can happen on a pushing for, descheduling side. But it all needs to happen simultaneously, or else we're going to end up in a world where not only do people not know uh, what who Jack Schreier is, but they won't even know, what he did or what people in that era did and why that matters for what we have now. And because if you just look at cannabis the way we have it now, in a lot of places, it's easy to see how there's lots of portions of the population, the voting population, that just dismiss us for one reason or another. And the fight back against that is definitely going to require education.
Well, my friend, I cannot thank you enough for coming and educating us tonight. To say I learned a little bit is an understatement. Yeah, we'll have to have you back in time, sir. Yeah, you're quite well versed in the ways of cannabis sociology, and of course, I work with you on other things, and I'm proud to see you grow and develop. Congratulations on your masters, and look forward to seeing where you travel in the future, sir. So. Thank you for taking the time out tonight. Please tell everybody, how do they find you? We didn't even mention the highest critic, which is, of course, a whole other thing. So I guess we'll have to have you back for another show sometime. But how do people find Caleb Chen on the interwebs?
Yeah, there's a website called thehighestcritic.com. You can find my Google Scholar page, I guess, calebY.chen, and subscribe to that for future more scholarly publications. But generally, yeah, the highest critic also on Instagram, if that's your cup of tea.
All right on. Okay, well, I would like to thank our council members, Nate Landau, Marilyn Mathery, Michael Crowitz, Mike Davis, and myself, Etienne Fontaine. Can't thank you enough for taking the time to educate this. I'm gonna have to rewatch this one and absorb a little bit, for sure. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on Hash Church on Sunday too. So it's always a pleasure. So, all right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This has been VAC Roundtable number 95 with Caleb Chen. So thank you all. Have a great one. We'll see you in a couple weeks.